Okay, let's talk about perception. So I mentioned in an earlier video that perception is other people's reality, right? And that's why you have to care about it because somebody else's reality is going to impact and shape your world and your opportunities, okay? So somebody else's perception about you in a job interview, right, determines whether or not you get that job and are able to provide for your family and the people you care about, right? Somebody else's perception could determine whether or not you get a promotion or whether or not somebody goes out with you and gives you a chance, right? So it does have an impact in our world. More specifically, we are going to talk about the perception process that people tend to engage in, obviously with a communication focus, influences and tendencies in perception, and improving perception accuracy. Okay, so what is the perception process that people tend to go into? So first of all, we basically engage in this process of selection, interpretation, organization, and retention. So selection is we engage in what's called selective attention. So we don't pay attention to everything, right? We pay attention to certain things that we want to, right? Now, there are some biases in that. There's something called basically, like it says here, selective attention, where essentially what we're doing is we only pay attention to things that we think, for example, will typically confirm our prior beliefs. So if you already think A about something and you see something that you think is probably going to confirm A, you're more likely to pay attention to it, right? Or things are going to tell us what we want to hear, right? We just tend to pay attention to the good and avoid the bad. Another thing that happens in our process is interpretation. So we tend to also cling to our prior point of view and expectations in a situation. So when an event happens, we were more likely to interpret it as aligned to what those expectations are. So I gave you that example about somebody approaches somebody and they're interested in them and they're asking them out or whatever it may be. They're expressing their interest and they're very confident in themselves, right? They think they're a catch. If the person decides not to go out with them, they're less likely to take that personally, right? Because their self-concept and self-esteem is one where they think they're attractive, they think they're a catch, and they're more likely to look at it as, well, I'm just not, the kind of person they're attracted to, right? So they interpret it that way. They interpret it based on their prior point of view. Organization. So we take information and in perceiving it, we tend to organize it a certain way. So what's that organization process? We tend to make generalizations or basically stereotypes, and we will classify people based on these generalizations. Now, in terms of nonverbals, and also just our verbal interaction, right? In terms of how we organize people, we will sometimes, when it comes to individuals, we'll look at their appearance, we'll look at their interaction style, and we'll also look at their social roles and kind of classify them based on these things and make judgments based on these things. So based on appearance, for example, we might make judgments about everything from education level, morality, viewpoints, political viewpoints, right? All of this sorts of stuff just based on appearance or people's interaction styles, right? Have you ever interacted with somebody and the way they're interacting or communicating with you, you don't know them very well, but the way they're doing these things, you make certain judgments about them or judgments about their identity, right? Based on that. Of course, right? Like people do this, right? So that's an example of how we organize this information based on certain cues, right? And then social roles, like based on how people are interacting, we'll kind of put them in a certain social role, whether that's things like success or popularity and things like that. So these are just some, when I'm talking about organization, when I bring up appearance, interaction style, and social roles, these are things that we tend to pay attention to and sort of have file folders for, right? That we have organized a certain way. But we also just generally engage in stereotype thinking. Now, here's the thing about stereotypes. Stereotypes is a word that's taken on this meaning that's usually viewed as kind of negative, right? Now, from a literal academic sense, stereotypes are not inherently necessarily negative or self-destructive. What a stereotype really is something called a cognitive script or a schema. So what a cognitive script or a schema is you just organize information and into a little file folder in your head, so to speak. And based on the information you're getting on that topic, you tend to highlight certain things. So you give certain things precedent, right? And then when you have to make a judgment on the topic, you just kind of go off whatever that file folder has highlighted, right? Or whatever whatever the stereotype, the generality you can make from like just reading like the cliff notes of the folder will tell you. So an example would be of the highlight example would be like if you think old people are bad drivers, every time you see another person, somebody who's a bad driver and they happen to be elderly, it's like you just highlight that page in your little folder about driving and you go, see, bad driver, just underline that, star that. Here's another example. So then the next time you think of elderly people, one of the things that's going to immediately pop to your mind is they're a bad driver, because after all, I have that page highlighted a lot, right? Another way they work with like just generalities is if you're in the woods and you see a bear, right? Your brain's going to not like sit there and want to, let's spend an hour interviewing the bear and analyzing the bear, right? To see if this bear is dangerous. Your brain's going to go to the stereotype of wild animal bear, stronger than me, carnivore, dangerous, bad, right? And you're going to do what you can to avoid a bear attack, right? Now, when you do that, you're stereotyping. You didn't get to know the bear. You didn't like analyze the bear's feelings. You didn't have a conversation. You stereotyped, right? Like stereotypes keep you alive. They help you conserve energy. When you drove the next time you drive somewhere, when you're driving somewhere, you're not like Siri. You're not going like right turn in 15 feet, left turn now. You're not analyzing everything you're doing because you've driven that route a million times. By the way, your brain is also engaging in a stereotype at that time. They're engaging in a cognitive script. You're on autopilot. You're doing, because that conserves energy, right? It's just easier to go through the motions without having to think about everything, right? Like think about if we had to like process constantly beyond processing everything, right? That would really be information overload and be like mentally draining, right? Like willpower is a resource and you'd run out of willpower to do that constantly. So what I'm trying to get at is that we stereotype all the time, and your brains use stereotypes to simplify things, allow you to not have to pay attention to everything all the time, and it just makes your world easier, right? So we do organized information into like stereotypes, quick ways to like make decisions and judgments. Old people are bad drivers, right? Bear bad. Now, obviously, where these go in a negative way is when the stereotypes are demonizing people or groups unfairly, right? Which happens a lot, obviously, right? Because, and the reason that that's usually unfair is because there's some exceptions. I think there are certainly groups throughout history that, like, you could say maybe the whole group's bad, but that's actually pretty rare. Like, most of the times it's very complex, right? Like most of the time, every group has bad actors, so they have people that go off the rails, but it doesn't mean the whole group's bad. It doesn't mean they speak for the whole group, right? And so where negative stereotypes are unfair is when they're towards a group or a person, and you're stereotyping the whole group when the whole group isn't bad, so to speak, right? But in general, we do engage in that. That's a part of our like built-in psychology. And then we also engage in a little bit of bias in terms of our retention. So like, what do we remember? So we also engage in selective retention. So I mentioned we have selective attention where we tend to only pay attention to the stuff we want to that's going to agree with us. We also have a tendency to only remember the stuff that agrees with us. Like we discount the bad, right? Or the stuff that we don't really want to hear. It's like we're hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. So that kind of happens as well. So other influences on perception are things like access to information, right? If you're not getting all the information or certain information or certain perspectives, that's going to influence you. Socialization and social interaction, so obviously who you're around, and there might be biases or blind spots in the information they're giving you, right? Social roles can influence things too. Do you respect somebody or the authority figure, and what they're telling you might then influence how much value or weight you give that opinion. And then culture can influence as well. So kind of giving you some examples of this. So let's take access to information. So you have an example here. You've got some logos here of news feeds. So this actually illustrates selective attention as well as this access to information kind of issue. So I mentioned people have a tendency to only expose themselves to information that pretty much agrees with them or is giving the opinion they already agree with. So an example would be like if you follow politics, right? So if you follow politics, if you're politically conservative, the odds are, and you watch news, right? You go home, you watch Fox News, and that's all you watch. Well, Fox News is pretty notoriously known to be very conservative, right? With conservative perspectives, leanings, and opinions on things. Now, let's say you're politically liberal. they do the same thing, right? The politically liberal person, odds are statistically that you go home, that person goes home, they watch MSNBC, and that's all they watch. MSNBC, also known notoriously to be very politically liberal. They give liberal perspectives, liberal critique of things, right? And so what's happening there is you're exposing yourself to information that's going to tell you what you want to hear, right? You're liberal, you're watching MSNBC, it's going to tell if you're liberal, good, conservative, bad. If you're conservative, you're watching Fox, it's going to tell you conservative, good, liberal, bad, right? And so it's just this feedback loop that's like self-confirming what you already believe, right? So your access to information is just reconfirming your own perspective. And by the way, there's research on this that shows that like you can pull viewers of certain networks and you say, what is your opinion on certain things? And they will give the opinion that the network has been saying, right? Including, by the way, things that are patently, like objectively incorrect, like we can just prove is not correct, right? That they will then say, oh yes, that is true, when it's been clearly shown to be false, right? So it shows you like the power that these things have. So access information, like, are you exposing yourself to kind of both sides of something, which people just don't do? And, politics is obviously kind of a heat example, but we see this with other issues. So, for example, people will have an opinion on just some random topic, right? And they only go out and expose themselves to further opinion that confirms like that viewpoint instead of looking at the other side, right? Like I see that with certain topics, like where you could be watching a YouTube video even where somebody has an opinion on something and they're in there and they're giving their side of it or they're criticizing something, but they never looked at the other side, right? They know nothing about the other side that they're criticizing. So, well, if you don't know anything about the other side that you're criticizing, their viewpoint or that subject matter, can you fairly critique it? Probably not, right? So access to information can really influence our perspective because that information might have a bent, right? Because it might be biased. Now, look, I do not think all, we're talking about media examples. I do not think all media is biased, like one way politically or another. It depends. There's some that are, there's some that aren't, right? Socialization, social interaction, that's basically just who you're around, right? Like that can influence your perception on things. They sort of teach you certain things. Since we're trying to focus on culture and communication, if you look at culture, a lot of the times where that can influence our perception in a potentially negative way is through something called ethnocentrism. So what ethnocentrism is evaluating other cultures according to preconceptions of one's own culture. So I mentioned this in an earlier video, which basically you judge another culture or another group of people as being right or wrong in what they're doing based on what your culture thinks is right or wrong, but you're not a member of that group, right? And so the problem is if you're not a member of that group, you might be judging them by a standard that they do not adhere to. So the issue is like, is that fair, right? Now, obviously the classic, whenever you hear like ethnocentrism is talked about in a lot of courses, like you take a sociology class, they will talk about this, for example. It's obvious how it cannot be fair in the sense of like that culture might not adhere to those standards or principles, right? So then it's not fair to judge them on it. And that's usually the context this topic always gets talked on. But you do have to keep in mind that like there's times where maybe it could be fair. Like, so in other words, if you think it's fair, you're basically making the argument of whether they adhere to this standard or perspective, they should, right? You're basically saying whether they think it's right or wrong, they're wrong. This is right, my viewpoint is correct. And maybe you're right? It's like saying, I think killing's wrong. And if you're dealing with a group that for some reason thinks killing's okay, you might be ethnocentric in the sense of your culture thinks it's wrong. And you're saying, man, you guys, you're just wrong if you don't think it's wrong, right? It just is, man. So whether, like what I'm trying to say is that whether ethnocentrism is good or bad kind of depends on how you want to view it. But what it basically is judging another group based on the standards of your own. And that's a common influence, a tendency in perception. Other tendencies, we tend to be swayed by the obvious. So this is things like appearance, for example, judging people based on appearance. And in fact, there's research that argues that we make like a series of like 10 evaluations just based on appearance alone. It's everything from things like popularity, education level, morality, all this kinds of stuff, right? It's, interpersonal success, career success. So we tend to be swayed by like obvious superficial things. Again, maybe because we're shallow, but maybe also, and probably also because it's just easier to make judgments that way, right? we tend to cling to first impressions. So whether it's good or bad, and we tend to stick to that and not move off of it. So this is sometimes referred to as something called the halo effect. So the halo effect is when you have a positive first impression of somebody, and because you view them as good, it doesn't matter what bad they do after that, you still view them in a good way. So it's like you won't move off of that first impression, right? And some of it is because it's complicated as to why people do that, but that's the halo effect, right? It's you immediately think of them as being the saint, and they can be a sinner for the next 5 years, and you still view them as the saint. You just won't move off of it. Now, why do people do that? A couple of reasons. I mean, on one level, there's a little bit of people just don't want to admit that they're wrong, right? They don't want to admit that their first impression was wrong. So they'll just rather double and triple down instead of admitting that they were wrong, right? Possibly. People don't want to admit that maybe the person changed, right? They just don't want to admit this stuff, right? They just don't do it. They're too far down the rabbit hole. So that's the halo effect. And the reverse can happen too, where people they initially thought somebody was bad, so to speak, and then they do a bunch of good things, and people won't change off of that initial impression. We also assume that others are similar to us. So meaning we make the assumption that they think the same way that we do. They make decisions the same way we do. They're going to view a situation or event the same way we do, right? We have a self-serving bias. So we also often tend to judge others more favorably we tend to judge ourselves more favorably than others. So a good example of this is, remember when I said you can place blame or credit in 3 places in an earlier video, where I said the blame or credit can go to you, it can go to someone else or something else. So what happens when we perceive an event is, if it's a good thing, we tend to credit ourselves. We're like, yep, it's because I'm awesome, right? Awesome town, population me. And when something bad happens, it's like because they're a loser, right? They're an idiot, okay? Or the self-serving bias of where you assess the blame or credit for something. So like an external thing happens, or something good happens, you might look at it as, for yourself, it's like, well, this thing happened that was bad, let's say. Well, this bad thing happened, but that was out of my control. Or wasn't I couldn't control that, or I couldn't control them. So you put it on something else or someone else. And then if something else bad happens to somebody else, it's, well, that's because they're a loser, right? Or that's because they're stupid, right? So in other words, which is where we assess blame. If it's ourselves in general, we will try to not put it on ourselves, and we'll try to give ourselves credit. So it's that self-serving bias. If it's other people, we try to blame them, right? Now this is barring. Now, if you have a situation where somebody has a low self-concept, low self-esteem, poor self-concept, right? Okay, maybe this doesn't happen, but kind of like for the everyday average person, there is this self-serving bias where we give ourselves props, we criticize other people. So you do have to be careful about that. Another thing that happens with framing is just presenting things from a strategic angle. So this is basically like with perception, you have persuasion that comes into play, like spinning something, right? And really that's what's going on here. So you're framing something and you're spinning stuff. What I'm basically trying to say is, so your perception also gets influenced because other people purposely try to influence, right? They try to spin it, they try to persuade you, right? So a specific type of persuasion and like spinning things a certain way. So it's sort of like you could look at it as this way or that way, and I want to influence you to look at it this way, right? That's presenting things from an angle. Now here's the thing about framing or spinning something. It could be the truth, and it's just the angle I want to show you, or the argument I want you to believe. It could be a lie. It could be partially the truth and partially a lie, right? It could be a combination of both. And by the way, that can be really effective, because sometimes when people don't know a lot about the topic or don't have access to all the information, it can be hard to tell where the truth ends and the lie begins, right? Because you don't have access to all the information, so you don't know where that happened, right? So it's easy for people to kind of manipulate that way. So that's kind of what like purposeful manipulating perception is. It's like spin, right, or framing. And so again, could be the truth, could be a lie. The example I like to use, it's like take a photo. Somebody takes a photo and it's just the raw photo. Like if you look at that as like just the truth, right? Now, if they Photoshop it a little bit. Well, now what is it? It's kind of like it's the truth and a lie because they photoshopped it, right? Or you could take a photo of a mountain, but if you take it in two different seasons and two different angles, right, like it's going to show you a different image, right? So it's a version of the truth, right? So that's kind of like when you persuade to manipulate to manipulate perception, that's kind of like the framing dynamic. That's like spinning something, right? When you persuade to manipulate perception. Okay, so I want to give you an example of this, just like a common like cultural media example of this stuff going on. So this is in one of the recent sort of flooding events. This came from a website. So they were covering this flooding event from storms and all this sorts of stuff. And so they showed this image, and they said 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a grocery store. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean there's anything inaccurate here. These could be 2 residents, and they could be wading through chest-deep water, right? Like they could live there. But look, this was taken from one of these like news chopper kind of things. It's not like they're down there interviewing these people, right? They don't know if they live there. Obviously, you're going to assume they're residents because who would purposely go into a flooded area to hang out, right? So we're going to assume that that's true, but it's not like they actually talked to them. Okay, so 2 residents wade through, so pretty benign just description. But here's the thing, same website describing this exact same event on the same day. Here's another photo and caption they had. A man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store. Same event, same community, same town. So they didn't talk to these people, they didn't interview these. But the perception that these are creating, the spin, so to speak, here, is certainly biased in one and not in the other. Okay? So think about it. And I'm not even saying this is intentional, because some of this stuff is not intentional. People just aren't really like paying attention to the language they use. So for example, okay, why are these people residents? Now, residents, okay? So these are residents who are just wading through this chest-deep water because they can get necessities, bread and soda, so they can survive. So these local people afflicted by this. Now, this person, he's a looter, right? I mean, he might have just got out of Best Buy, grabbing iPhones and, I don't know, PlayStations. Looter. He's not, and by the way, he's not a resident either. He's not described as a resident. And you can say, well, why does that matter to describe him as a resident or not? Well, let me ask you this. If it doesn't matter, then why do they describe them as a resident? I thought it doesn't matter. So, pick which horse you're going to ride. Either it matters or it doesn't. Okay, if it doesn't matter, then why use the word resident here? Right? Because when you describe, the reason the word matters is when you say somebody's a resident, you're saying they're local, you're saying they belong there. Okay, they're not a thief, they belong there. This is their home. Right? So this person is described as a looter, right? So after looting a grocery store. So just loot. By the way, he's carrying the exact same thing they are, soda. They're carrying soda. Like, what are we talking about? Or at least according to them, they're carrying soda, right? Now, again, if you want to go negative, somebody will take this and say, well, it was racist and all that sorts of stuff. Maybe it is, maybe it is not. I don't know. I'm just describing, these are objective realities that one was people finding bread and soda, and the other one is somebody looting it. One is a resident, one is just a random looter, right? Those are objective realities of the language used, right? And the objective reality is that it's usually better to be described as a resident than a looter. That's not debatable. That's not an opinion. That's not spin, right? So if you want to be negative, somebody would say it's racist. Now, look, I'm not saying it actually is, because I do think a lot of things like this are unintentional. I think people just don't think about the language they're using, right? I also think it might have been just a subconscious thing where somebody looks at that and they see a younger person here, so they think looter, right? It doesn't mean it's a racist thing. It doesn't, like, all this stuff is not always intentional, right? So sometimes it is. I mean, obviously media spins things intentionally sometimes, but I don't think it always is. But this is an example, though, whether you think it's intentional or not, whatever you think of this is an example of how language and spin can affect perception. So it does give you that, right? You are getting that for your money here. So that's basically an example of that. So we just kind of want to end here with, like, so how the heck do you improve your perception accuracy? So I want to talk about it like at an individual level, but also just like when it comes to like socialization, media, like information you're exposed to, excuse me, how can you improve perception regarding that? So in terms of like news outlets and just like stuff you see on social media and all this, like basically the socialization dynamic, run it through a test, right? And here's basically the way to kind of like determine, are they spinning this? Is this the truth, right? Like that I'm getting here. So a couple of things. So you can run it through this test of reliability, bias. Is it out there somewhere else in the ethosphere? And also, is it current? Okay. So here's how you run the test. So reliability. So you got to ask yourself, is the author and the sources they're using, the people they're quoting, people that you trust? That's the first question. Now, sometimes the author is, but sometimes their sources are not. So, like, you believe the person's trustworthy, but where they're getting their information might not be trustworthy, right? So you have to ask yourself that. That's a really good test right away. Bias. So that's different than reliability. So reliability is basically saying, do I trust them? Do I think this person knows or would know, okay, about this? Bias is basically whether I think they would know or not, whether I think they're credible or not, do I think they have a reason to lie to me or spin it, right? So reliability is, do I think they're trustworthy? Would they know? Do I think their sources would know? Bias is, well, yeah, even though they would know, are they the one who, do they have a reason to lie? Do they have like a financial motive? Usually it's finances, right? So this would be the classic, like somebody is a doctor, they have a medical background, and they tell you something, but you find out that like they're being funded by some company that gives them a reason to say that, right? Or somebody tells you a piece of information, but something in their background would like, yeah, they would be the one to know, but they've got a financial motive or some reason in their background to give a certain opinion to be biased. So just because people are reliable on the surface does not mean that what they're telling you isn't spin, right? Just because they have the credentials, it looks like they're the one who would know. It does not mean it's not being like spun or framed, or they're trying to influence your perception in some way. The bias can just come with how they sometimes have a financial motive to lie to you or tell you a certain version of something, or just an incentive because they want you to believe something, right? They want you to have a certain viewpoint, so they spin it, right? So that's basically what bias is.